I'm not willing to go back and rewrite all my contracts because, God, that would take forever and be hard. So, how do I do things automated instead of using manual spreadsheets and things like that to go do that process? And that's what we do. That's what we bring to market to make that much simpler, much quicker, and get your liquidity working for you, reduces your credit risk because you have less exposure, and it improves automation. So now you have a straight through processing. So, all things that are extremely important to us.
My name's Max Gagliardi, and this is Always Be Building. If you're watching this video, take a moment, hit the subscribe button on YouTube, or you can follow me on your favorite podcast app. Hope you enjoy the show. Chris, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
A big fan of the podcast, been following your work for a long time, fellow energy podcaster, although I've branched out a little bit. Most of what I do is energy. Huge props to the amount of episodes that you've done and just the wide range of topics that you covered. Super impressive. But for the guests that may or may not know you or your background, why don't you just give a little on yourself and then we'll dive into it.
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Chris Sass. I'm the co-founder and chief revenue and marketing officer of a company called Fidectus. That's my day job. We do post-trade processing, software as a service for energy traders. When we started the company up, I really wanted to know more about energy. So I started Insider's Guide to Energy podcast. And that was, I guess, probably a couple hundred episodes in now. The main show, I think, is about 120 or in the low 120s, but we have several other shows that go at the same time. So there were probably about 200 episodes in, and it's been a really fun ride.
It's awesome, man. I mean, that's such a grind. I know how it is. Like I am probably close to 200 episodes now on what I've been doing. I think we started relatively around the same time. Incredibly rewarding, but also just it takes a lot of work. I mean, I think somebody like you understands that. I don't know that the listeners do always understand it, but the amount of respect that I have for it is massive. And I'm just excited that you're keeping it going because I think it's one of these things where you can flame out. And so just real quick to start, like talk about that journey and what, the challenges that have been with it and the rewards as well.
Sure, absolutely. So the Insider's Guide started out as a serendipitous walk through energy. That's how I describe it. Our topics go all over the place. Our ratings would be much higher if we stayed disciplined just on one topic, but it really goes where the hosts or the producers want to go. So if we find an interesting guest, we bring the guests on. We spend quite a bit of time producing that show. It comes out once a week for the main show. And it was a little bit of a slog the first year or so. At this point, we have people inbound approaching us, every day. We get multiple guests trying to get on the show. So it's a little bit easier to be selective now and choose the topics we want. But I can tell you that first year or so, it's a grind. And the other thing is that we like to release every week. So it's a bit challenging. The first time I let one of my co-hosts run the show without me, that was a little nerve-wracking. So on occasion, you'll hear an episode that I'm on vacation or doing something, but the show comes out. So
it's great. I mean, I think that for me, I've recently gone through a rebrand. So I started out as Talk Energy. I got to about 160 episodes. I really started feeling the fatigue around just covering energy topics, although there's such a broad spectrum of things you can cover in energy. There's always something new to talk about, but I felt like for the longevity, I needed to pivot and kind of make it more broad, even though I think probably 60% of my stuff is still energy. Do you ever feel that fatigue, or like, do you ever say this is like the fifth conversation I've had about solar or like whatever, and you start to say, am I running out of content, or has it been pretty easy to keep it fresh?
So I think when it comes to like the mini series, we did like an ETRM mini series, all about risk management software, and by design, that was esoteric, really limited audience. We were targeting about 1,000 users that were using the software, and they engaged it. But I could tell you by about 13 hours of interviews on that, I was getting pretty fatigued on the topic. I think like solar or some things that we try not to overlap, but there's a little bit of overlap. I think there's still a lot of innovation and things taking place. So we continue to expand. I don't mind doing multiple episodes because I think when you get into the detail, for me, there's a slight different variant of how people do things. So if it's too repetitive, it's not exciting. But I think there's still enough to go on right now. I mean, we just did fusion. We're doing finance, some really advanced finance this week and topics. And those are things that most people tell me they can't find anywhere else. They don't have an expert just like telling them like, how they're doing these things. And then occasionally I get people like, wow, that's way over my head. But, that's the risk when you go to an energy podcast.
Yeah. I think like I would love to dive into the energy topics a bunch, kind of the back half of the episode for people that are listening. But for me personally, I'm very, very much passionate and interested in entrepreneurship and startups. I've been an entrepreneur and on my own for about 9 years now, and have not really worked for for a company during that time period. And it's mostly been in the energy space. So love to hear the story there with your current company. I'm also just interested from the perspective of, our company does trading. We have a natural gas marketing, crude oil marketing business where we trade the product, and we do that on behalf of our clients. We don't trade power, and so I don't know what your guys' platform is, if it's for just power trading or if it's natural gas, but would love to hear about what you're doing there and talk about the journey, because that's just something that always fascinates me, hearing these startup stories.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've spent my career doing startups. I've worked in in telecommunications and in other technology companies. Did a bunch of Silicon Valley kind of companies, taking them to exit, where we either took them public or sold them, or did other strategies like that. A few years back, a number of years back, my colleague was running the PwC energy practice out of Switzerland for Europe. And he called me up and he said, "Hey, I've got this great idea for a startup. And basically, for energy traders, they're still doing all this manual process and stuff in post trade. Same in North America, same in Asia, and same in Europe." And he goes, "I'd like to solve that problem." Now, I'm a technologist by nature. I really like doing technology. So at first, it was a little bit of a yawn. I was doing a spin out from a company from Cisco Networks at the time. And I'm like, "Oh, I'll take a look at it." I took a week's vacation, went over and met some of the largest energy traders in Europe and said, "Tell me about this problem, help me understand it. And if we built a product, would you want it?" And all said yes. So 3 months later, we raised our first seed round and we had a prototype built and we had customers on board. And by the end of the first year, we had a commercial product for power and gas in Europe. And then, as I'd said, that the solution now, the reason you're talking to me from Houston today, is we do North American gas settlement. That's a problem statement. There's about 20 days of float that people have, and there was a company trying to do it, and there's a blockchain effort underway to try to do it. But we have a solution that works today. So we're working with North American gas traders, saying, "Hey, if you want to do your settlement and have it be efficient, if you want to do your confirmations and other elements, we can help you with that."
That's really interesting. So the specifics of it are, walk people that may not know.
Sure.
I mean, I live in that world, but talk about these problems that you guys are trying to solve or that you are solving,
Well,
and
I'll
give
talk
a little
about
bit
your
more of the.
entrepreneurial question, but I'll answer the problem we solved first, and I'll go back into maybe a little bit more about forming the
Sure.
company. So basically, what happened is in energy trading, whether it be natural gas, whether it be crude, or whatever commodity it is, of the type of electrons, whatever we're doing, there's a front office that does a lot of the sexy stuff, and they got great software, and they do trading and stuff, and risk management, and all those components. But once a deal's done, you need to confirm that the terms are aligned across all the parties. So there's some software that does that. There's ETRM software and other risk management platforms out there, and it kind of helps you manage the risk. And then you go to the confirmation piece, and a lot of that was still manual, but some is software. And then after that, you go to settlement. So I deliver whatever the commodity is. I deliver the gas through the pipeline, I deliver the electricity, whatever it is. And at that point, I need to do some post trade things. So basically, you get something like an invoice, a legal document that says, "Here's your invoice." And on the other side of the deal, your counterparty has a shadow invoice or a purchase order, and they're expecting. So, did it go through this pipeline? Did it come out? And did I have loss? Did I have all these things? And we have to agree to all those terms, just like you would reconcile your Visa bill at the end of the month. You make sure that what's on your bill is what you did. Energy companies do that. And it's still a very manual process. Now, depending on where you are, so if you're in North America, you follow standard contracts, it takes about 20 days to settle. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal until you realize that cash flows between energy companies can be billions of dollars a month. And so when you start looking at the economies and say, okay, well, when gas is tight or money is tight, I'd rather have liquidity and have that cash working for me. But I'm not willing to go back and rewrite all my contracts because, God, that would take forever and be hard. So how do I do things automated instead of using manual spreadsheets and things like that to go do that process? And that's what we do. That's what we bring to market to make that much simpler and much quicker and get your liquidity working for you, reduces your credit risk because you have less exposure, and it improves automation. So now you have a straight through processing. So all things that are extremely important to our customers.
Makes a lot of sense. We deal with those issues as well, right? We have to get the revenue in on behalf of our clients, and then we have to send our markets an invoice. To your point, it's got to match from a volumetric standpoint as well as a price standpoint. So, however the gas is being priced, if it's a daily price, the first of the month, or if there's a mix, and then there could be invoices that come in. So, if we are buying the product, a lot of times, if there's invoices, for example, like transport, we will process those on behalf of the client. So we will basically net those fees and pay those invoices, and then create at the end of the day a pay sheet, and provide that to the client, and then remit the payment, and where they can see that all these things are correct. And it's not just our client who we're buying the product from; it's also the counterparty that we're selling it to. And so I'm very familiar with that process. And today, it's pretty much manual. So maybe your guys' software is something that we should look at potentially.
We do. We work with other folks that do similar things that you do. One of the things that's really cool that we did is we took a philosophy saying, look, you can only control your business, right? So if I'm a gas trader here in Houston and all I do is gas trading, I can't control the process of my counterparty. But what I want to have is a single workflow. And so if I do, let's say, only a few deals a year with someone, they may not invest in the infrastructure to have electronics all the way through. And so from our philosophy and our platform's point of view, we always make the counterparty look like they're electronic to our users. So the platform and our users always have a single workflow, a single dispute management process, and the other side doesn't. But we're getting a lot into the product. I'd love to go back to the entrepreneurial question you have.
Sure.
That's it's a big
Yeah.
thing.
Let's go into that. I mean, talk about this process of starting a business from the conceptual idea, which is basically we've identified a problem or a pain point. We think we can solve it. There's an economic benefit there, and just walk me through kind of the idea phase through the nuts and bolts of getting something off the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and ironically, you asked about my podcast. My podcast, I did the same process I did, just like I started the company. Basically, we started with an idea and a problem statement. We tested the market. We went out and saw users that could make a difference if they were there. I've been in the industry selling technical solutions for about 20, 25 years. And I have a belief that I've come along the way is if someone doesn't have skin in the game, they're not going to be a part of my solution. So once we
Mm.
vetted the idea, we went out to a handful of marquee accounts and said, look, if we build this, would you sign up for it? And if you do, I'd expect you to pay for a pilot program of it. So we did that in the very beginning. What that did for us is it made it very easy to go out and get funding for a company. So if you're not familiar with kind of the process, you get your founders together. Basically, you have the team, and you're basically selling the founders and the idea. That's what the seed round goes to. So if you're going to go raise money, you go do that. We chose to do it in Zurich, Switzerland, which was crazy for me because all the other companies I'd experienced in were starting in the U.S. But the North American market was a little behind the European market. There were some standards coming out. We wanted to get Europe under control first before we came back into North America. And so we set up a company in Europe, got funding, and basically built a prototype and commercialized it, put the team together. And over time, what ends up happening is you go through your seed round, and once you validate it and get out into the market and customers start using it and you go show revenue, then you go back and you raise venture capital. And that's what we did. So we went out to the capital markets and raised capital to get the company in place, which is a really nice way to do it because then we can focus on product and vision and not be focused on day to day, keeping the lights on, but really have the runway to go build an appropriate product and to scale for the market. So in this case, we decided our first couple of years would be in Europe, scaling up Europe and getting our brand and identity over there and winning the European market, which we achieved. And then the plan was to go to North American markets, which we entered about 6 months ago. And we are doing that now and building the team up here in North America to scale up here. And then eventually, if it goes to plan, we'll go into the Asian markets. And that will be kind of our plan to conquer the world.
No, it's great. And let me ask you this. So when you went and raised initially, was that what you would define as like a pre-seed round? Was it, there was no revenue? Was there even a product yet? Or was it a
No,
draft of a product prototype?
frankly, raising money and energy these days, is not the hardest thing to do if you have the experience and you have the network. It's really not. If you've got a reasonable idea, there's capital to be had, especially for the first couple $1 million or whatever, just to get you going. It's really a function of having the right team, the right experience, and having the right vision and story. So basically, when you're at that point, you take your vision together, you build a slide deck, you practice a whole lot, and you go out and do pitches. The interesting thing in the energy space specifically is, I joined with a colleague who came from the energy space and didn't really do startups that much. And so he'd signed up for all these pitch competitions and things that were more general than energy. And the quick lesson was it was a great place to go practice our pitch. But if you didn't understand the energy market, you couldn't immediately see the value in the market size that we were going after because it was complicated. So most VCs really want a really short story. They want to say it's like the Uber of this or the, whatever the thing that's hot at the moment and they can relate to, that's what they want you to say. So if you solve a problem that isn't one of those, you really need industry insiders to understand. And in energy, it makes a huge difference when you go to a fund and there's lots of funds that are focused on energy or institutions, and that will make a big difference. In the seed round, it was easier to find capital, but the lesson learned there and being more seasoned is I watched folks sign up and give a lot of their companies away. If you have a good product and a good vision and you can stick your ground, you can really construct a deal that's more profitable for you as a founder. If you're a first time going through this and you take the terms that are put on the term sheets put near you, you're basically giving your company away in the first 6 months or 12 months anyway. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I watch people all around me do that all the time. I advise, I do angel funding for companies, and you'll see people willing to give the company away too soon. Got to
Yeah.
have faith.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a venture capital. It's a guy that's founding a venture capital firm. They had kind of an investment club model, and they've recently pivoted to raising a fund, and they're looking at tech, not necessarily energy, but just tech in general. And he was basically saying that it was difficult for them to get in at the pre-seed or seed round, that they wanted to see something more established. And one of the points that he made, because we talked offline, and because we've got a little fledgling software business that we're working on here that we've started up. We've been working on it for about 3 years. We started commercializing it this year. And he was like, can you use this product across industries? And the main reason to ask that was because the total addressable market, or basically the size that you could grow it to, could be much larger versus if it was just energy. Do you guys look at those types of metrics? Like, what's our total,
We
addressable market?
do, but I go back to, and maybe it's my Silicon Valley roots or whatever, is if you try to do too much, you lose focus early on. So it really depends on the investor. An astute investor will look at the technology and say, hey, could you apply it somewhere else? Energy is a huge market. There's trillions of dollars going into it. It's not going to go away. It goes up and down a little bit, but volatility is good for what we do anyway, for our part of the solution. And I think the market's big enough. Our solution is applicable to other markets, but being a niche is where I was trying to say before, is this is the first company I've done that is so niche that we literally focus on the energy market. And frankly, there's plenty of air in the room to breathe, right? So I think the returns on an investor would get are there. The downside of doing energy and the marketing campaign and stuff is I can tell you who all my customers are. I don't need to go put ads in magazines. I don't need to go all over the world and tell people these things because there's a finite number of companies in North America and in Europe. There's a large number, but there's a finite number, so I can address them very easily. So it's a little bit different than a broader software use case. The more than likely scenario is that what we get a lot of interest from is folks looking at us that want to enter into energy. And so there are other industries that do invoicing and post trade and things like that would like to maybe make that bridge. And they look at us more as a bridge because they haven't been able to get into it. A thing that's
Yeah.
unique, and you come from energy, you probably know this, is I've watched a lot of technical people try to do energy companies and they fail. The inside knowledge of being in the business is fundamental, and it's the nuance. The devil, I always say, is in the detail. So making software isn't particularly hard if you understand the problem statement. The challenge is a lot of technology people say, hey, I'm just going to do a blockchain thing. I'm just going to stuff this in. The industry would do great. They'll do it. And they don't take the time to really learn the industry. And they tend to fall short because there is so much nuance and history through energy. Anyone that does trading in it will see that when I've seen a startup be a flash in the pan, and even the 4 years that I've done this current company, I've seen startups come and go because they come in as technologists and they don't really listen. They don't really pay attention to the business problem, and they're having trouble. But the addressable market's big enough to justify fairly significant investment.
Yeah. It's a really interesting point you make around understanding the energy side. So like with what we're doing with our Encova View product is not rocket science. I mean, to your point, you can build software. And I think that the biggest thing that we bring to the table is more the knowledge around what we're doing. So it's like you could take it to a person who's just a tech person and say, build this, and they could build the infrastructure, the architecture for it, and it wouldn't be that difficult. The difficult part is translating our world to somebody that doesn't understand it. And it's even difficult within people that have 30 years experience doing what we're doing. Contracts are complicated. We're more focused from the wellhead to the sales point in terms of that data and making sure that people are getting paid correctly, doing a lot of similar things in essence, kind of what you're talking about, but it's really more from the wellhead to the sales point for oil and gas versus from the downstream sales point on to the end users and the trading function. And so it's like just being able to translate that and be able to implement it is one of the most difficult parts. It's not necessarily the technology itself. It's really more the subject matter expertise and the reason why no one's done it. And what we're trying to do is because it just takes a lot of knowledge of that specific niche of the industry. And then you have to add the tech to it. So like that intuitively to what you're saying, it makes a lot of sense. And I think that that is a challenge that people that just have that tech background only are going to face if they're trying to get into an industry that's as complex and nuanced and complicated as energy.
I don't think I would have been as successful as we've been had I not partnered with someone that knew energy. So if you look at the way we started the company, there were two of us, the original founders. We quickly brought in two additional founders, brought a CTO and a COO, an operations head in. 50% of them were 20 years plus in the energy industry. That was my CEO that we put in the CEO role because it makes sense in energy and our operations. And then I brought someone in from my past life, a technologist for the technology point. And I don't think we would have had the success or the credibility to be in the room with folks. I mean, like I said, our customers are doing 10 billion plus cash flows a month, and we're part of that stream. So they kind of have to have trust in us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think about the marketing and advertising and just getting the word out aspect of the business? And I know you're doing the podcast, and I'll just lead you a little bit on this question where I've struggled with it is that, a lot of our business is B2B, right? It's like we're trying to reach these other companies, and there really isn't that many of them. Honestly, I mean, it's in the hundreds in terms of like the people that would probably be a good fit for some of the services that we provide. It's not, maybe it's in the 1,000 plus, probably, maybe it's 1,000 or 2,000, but realistically, our target audiences to get the word out to are hundreds of companies. We kind of know who they are versus say a B2C, a business to consumer. I think that using media, using a podcast, using social media can be extremely effective when you've got this broader audience. Like if you're pitching a fitness thing, right? Like how many people are in the fitness world? Like everybody wants to be healthier. Your audience is millions and millions of people. You can create a platform and it's kind of a shotgun approach. How do you view like the podcast and what you're doing on the media front
Sure.
and how that can benefit your business that you have today, trying to do that business to business outreach?
So I don't consider our podcast or my podcast to be a company asset. I do it separately for myself. As I said, it was a way to learn energy really well. I talk to leaders in the industry, CEOs, founders, heads of technology, several times a week. So it keeps me very fresh in what's going on in the industry. It's across all spectrums of the industry. We do renewables, we do carbon settlement, we do all kinds of stuff, but it very seldom aligns to what I do on the podcast. What the company gets value out of from doing that is in-kind sponsorship, where they do some sponsorship and be one of the sponsors of the podcast. But even that changes from time to time. I have new sponsors now that aren't necessarily the company I work for, right? So I don't think it's there, other than just making sure that everybody in the industry. As you said, the industry isn't particularly large. There's players that are there. I mean, the interesting thing is I've got a couple of folks. I'm chief marketing officer at a company, and building brand was easy because, I mean, we do a couple of big trade shows a year. We speak quite a bit, and then we meet people. But I always laughed that it would be cheaper for me just to have a book written on settlement, or write a book on settlement, self-publish it, and send it to the 1,000 people that I care about in the industry, right? My marketing spend would be a lot cheaper than trying to do any kind of mass marketing. So right now I've got two people on my marketing team that work for me, and one of them is writing his master's thesis. And it was really hard to explain to him that yes, you work in my marketing department, but realize that I don't really care about a lot of the social media and things you're doing. What I really care about in the case of Europe is, the one standard deviation where the folks that are going to be important to our company are going to be. And so it's a very different kind of marketing than when it's even B2B for Fortune 1000, where there's a huge pool. This is a really small pool.
Yeah.
So to answer your question is, I think what you do is, my first year in the business was getting phone numbers and contacts. I wish I'd been in the US, because GDPR makes it really hard to get a hold of people in Europe. Most of my effort was just finding out how to get a hold of the person I wanted. And once I got a hold of them, just having conversations one-on-one, because it's in the hundreds, it's not in the thousands.
Sure. And I think like what you're saying resonates with me because the podcast wasn't an effort to pump our businesses or to try to drive sales. And it was more just the curiosity, the personal growth, the networking. But you often look at it and you say, okay, you've built an audience, you've built a platform. Or I say you do. I do. I often look at it and say, you built an audience, a platform. You're getting a lot of outreach. How do you monetize these efforts? And I think that the best and easiest way is if you have something valuable to sell or a service to provide, which we do across a couple of different industries with the companies that we have. But then it's like, well, I've got this broad audience. It's not really that niche. Like, had I just done a podcast that was specific to my niche of what we do, it'd probably be pretty effective because people would be tuning in just to listen to that one specific topic and niche. And so I'm just always curious
But
to
I think you
hear,
would have burned out sooner, right?
oh,
So I
way
think the
sooner.
difference is every company. Most of my guests have a podcast. Most of my guests come from an organization that has a podcast. And yet they're coming on our show to do something different, right? Because their following generally is, you're already your customers, or perhaps a near-term customer coming on board. And so I think for me, it's just the passion to follow all the things about energy in the podcast. It's a lot of fun. I really enjoy it. The team that I work with enjoys it, and we have a good time doing it. But I think we can do commercial things. Like I said, there's been one or two episodes that clearly overlap. There's been a few times I generally don't even talk about my company, where my guest has brought up that, oh yeah, we use your solution. Well, great. Um, but I think it'd be a short shelf life. I mean, our episodes right now, I have increases of episodes. Every episode goes up every week, because every week we find new audience, and new audience goes back and they suddenly go, oh, I didn't even know you guys existed. And suddenly they go back and listen to 5 old episodes. I think that would be less so unless they were solving a really specific problem on our software. I think they would get tired of it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a longevity game, and that's again why I kind of rebranded to go a little bit more broad. It gives me the ability to kind of talk about whatever I wanted. And a lot of people were like, "You could still do that and call it Talk Energy," and I was like, "Yeah, I know," but I just felt like I feel like you got to evolve, and for me, it's just the ability to keep it fresh and talk about new and different things has been huge. But pivoting back to the company, I had a question specifically around some solutions. Do you guys do anything on the regulatory or compliance side? I know a lot of this post settlement stuff. There's compliance aspects to this. You got to
Absolutely.
report in the U.S. to FERC and things like that. But talk
Yeah,
about any
absolutely.
solutions
So
there.
regulatory reporting is one of the services. So when we started out, my belief in starting a company is you stay focused, you have limited features, and you meet a very specific problem. And we did that fairly quickly. Within the first year, we productized, had customers live on our platform. And then they said, well, hey, we've got these other vendors that do different things, regulatory reporting, confirmations, and other things like that. And we don't want to have a multi-vendor environment. And I never want to go into a space where I have to go head to head with someone. That doesn't seem like an ideal use of capital to go do that and resource. And so regulatory reporting was coming up. There's changes if it takes place. And so what we do is we partner, we have some fundamental built into our platform, and then we partner with some of the brands. So, if I need to do US regulatory reporting, I want to make sure I have a leading partner there. Just like with ETRM vendors, what we've also found is I need to be agnostic to who I partner with and be open, because no two companies are the same. Every energy trader, especially here in Houston, thinks they're special, or perhaps they are special, but they have a unique nuance of process and through acquisition and growth or whatever, multiple vendors involved. So a lot of times, if I dictate what they have to do, that won't go well. And so we support multiple regulatory reporting, and that's one of the 3 legs of the stool, basically, in post-trade that you have, right? So it's settlement. That's important for everybody. They want to do that. We covered that in the beginning. That's where we fundamentally started, whether it's broker settlement, whether it's settlement for your trades, like you talked about, getting 3 parties or 2 parties settled. Then it's regulatory reporting because I have reporting obligations, what's legal, what's there. So that ties into it. And confirmations tie into it. And then one of the other elements that we've added as well is things like dynamic discounting. This is pretty cool. What we ended up saying is, look, if we have all this stuff in place, and it's kind of like with your smartphone, when you started out with a smartphone, it was just a phone. You didn't know you're going to pay for your parking and buy movie tickets, order your food, and do everything else with the thing, right? It was a phone. And eventually killer apps came along the way. Well, I think in post trade, besides being straight through processing, which everybody wants because it's more efficient and less error prone, finance angle of post trade has become important as well. Because, like I said, you can choose to close the settlement period closer, but not everybody wants to do that. Some of these folks will buy gas and only buy gas. And in that situation, they're not incented to pay you any quicker because they like having the float. And so there's some post-trade settlement that we can do. For example, today you could say, hey, you know what, Max? If you want to close with me today, I'll give you a 1/4 point discount. And you can agree to me outside of the standard of contract. We can just do it in software and agree that if that's available, I'll offer it to you, and you can take that or not take that. And then in the future, what you'll see additional financing opportunities where you might say, hey, even though it's not like trade finance on the front end, I just want to have my liquidity today. Hey, can Fidectus help me get there? And the answer to both of those is yes as well. And so you can see the evolution of killer apps coming based on having the digital infrastructure in place.
Yeah, that's a good point. You build something that's the architecture, it has the framework, and then you just see how it evolves. And a lot of it sometimes is like the feedback from the clients, right? It's like, hey, can it do this? It's like, well, no, it doesn't do it today, but that's actually a great point. And so it's like, as you roll it out and work with people, do you see it evolving just given what the clients are asking for? And are you learning through that feedback?
Absolutely, you have to be customer driven. The danger there is there's a few large oil or gas companies that we deal with that could break us as well, right? So you need the fortitude to have vision to stick with it, meet the customer need, because that's otherwise they'll stop buying from you. But you really also want to drive the vision. So it's a fine line, and that's part of the trickiness of being a founder in a small company. What I would tell them, our leadership team in meetings early on, is like, be careful what you wish for. They come back and say, well, did you go win this account or that account? And I'm like, well, we're not quite ready to go win a couple of those accounts. We are now, but this was like in the first year. They're like, oh, well, let's go after them. I'm like, careful, if we win them, they'll break us. And so there's
Yeah.
that fine tuning of growing a company to be able to scale. Do we have the support organization? Do we have the deployment techs? Do we have all the people to do the stuff you want to do at scale? And then are they going to ask for left-handed monkey wrenches like you just described? If it's great and I can productize it, we build it all day long. But I know in North America, there was a company trying to do settlements. It was around for about 9 years. Their former CEO works for us. And one of the challenges they had is they just built too many custom solutions. So we're a big believer of a software as a service, APIs, and making stuff that we can resell. Because if it's one-off, even if you pay me to go do it, it's not scalable or sustainable from our company's point of view.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've tried to, because with the software stuff that we're doing, I wasn't a tech guy, so I've tried to read a few of these, popular books like Inspired. There's a couple others that talk about building a software company, and that's a point that you see come up, right? It's like don't go chasing down these rabbit trails too much because you can lose your way and lose your focus on the core of the business. And you always want to say yes, right? It's always kind of like,
Well, not
I want to.
necessarily. We say
I
no
mean,
a lot. So that's probably different from being maybe like where I'm at, from having done this a lot, or maybe it's just different VCs and board members and things. I think what I believe personally and why we've been successful is, if you're going to get to know quickly, right? That's a sales adage that I always believe from a commercial side. But I also think, we try to be smart on the business we want to win because we probably will win it. And like I said, if someone has my development team go off in 3 or 4 sprints in a row because we're agile and go build stuff that I just can't sell anywhere else, that affects my greater pipeline and it affects the satisfaction of my other users. So we actually do say no, and it's really hard to do when you're young and hungry as a company because every dollar in is really significant at that time. But you got to play the long game, I think.
that's really good. That's great points. All right, pivoting to the energy side, talk to me about what excites you on the topics that you cover. I mean, if you go look at your podcast, you're covering a broad range of things. What has been lately the trends or the things that you're getting fired up to talk about that are piquing your interest that you find the most interesting in the energy space? I know it's a super broad question, but we'll dive into some more specific questions here in a minute.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. So I'm mentoring a graduate student right now, and he went through and listened to all our episodes of the podcast. And besides he may need a better social life, he watched the journey that I went through. So when I started the podcast, I was pretty naive. Things were pretty black and white. It's all renewable. We're going to save the world, and life is great. And then you start getting into energy and really understanding the industry and how complex the problems are. And that gas isn't going away tomorrow. Hydrocarbons aren't going away tomorrow. Despite how much someone might want that to happen, the world would end, right? Or the economy would end as we know it. And then you start evolving, saying, okay, well, solar's cool, storage is cool. I like a lot of the storage. I like a lot of the electrification conversations because I think they're closer to reality of where we're at. But the stuff that excites me is usually, people doing innovative technologies. So, whether you're taking data centers and only using green energy and moving, distributed compute around the world to cool places, where it's green at the time you're doing the compute because no one cares where your compute is. Things like that I think are fun. Really enjoyed. I just did an episode on fusion. Still a little ways away, but I'm really excited that fusion will be cool in the future. So I like that. I like some of the way out things. We did solar from space as another thing that was really fun recently, where it's basically having solar panels in space and getting the cost down. That countries that have got that on their radar for 2035 to 2050. So it's really just around the corner. All that stuff to me is kind of cool because it's kind of Buck Rogers futuristic, but it's really not that far away.
Do you ever like get worn out or deal with like the political aspect of energy? It's like something that I'm not a big politics person. I try to stay away from it, but it seems
I've
like the
listened to your
energy.
podcast before. I don't know that you stay away from it. I think you're just rather frank with your opinions.
Well, I mean, I try to be at this place where I would like to stay away from it, but it seems like I can't. And because it just seems like everything in energy is so political. And what I've found is that, I've had guests on that are diehard fossil fuel people. And then I'll have followers on Twitter that are like kind of rage against the machine. They
Yep,
hate the green movement. They don't believe in it. And then I'll have like a climate scientist on, give their perspective, and then I'll find those people like unfollowed me, or I'll lose some of that audience and so I wonder, like, if you're, for example, going really hard on renewables and green energy, and then you get a bunch of people in your distribution channel that care about that. If you have some episode on, let's say, about natural gas and bringing up really good points about how it's not going away or something like that, does that turn those other people off, or just how do you
absolutely.
deal with like the two different sides?
So, so I just am true to myself. And like I said, it's a journey, right? If you asked me 2 years ago for an opinion, and 2 years from now, I'm sure I'll be at a different vantage point where I'm at. I saw comments like on a YouTube video, just they were slamming me for not believing this scientist, and I was actually very open to what the scientist was saying. I just have a pragmatic view of the world because I'm in the energy industry, and they said that I was discounting what was going on. You know, what I believe is whether it's someone from a hydrocarbon company, whether it's one of the oil companies, whether it's natural gas or whatever, I don't think I've met anybody that's intentionally trying to do harm to the planet. There's probably someone out there, but not the normal conversations. I think everybody wants to do right by what they can do, and I think there's just different vantage points and different knowledge, and it's complicated. The challenging one is I had, I think, one person on that said everything I said was absolutely wrong because he believed that we need to radically stop climate change in like hours. Like everything needs to stop. And I was kind of saying, well, natural gas was a step in reducing carbon from all the coal burning plants and turbines. And then you could do carbon capture and you could do things to make a transition work and still keep people going. And I clearly upset people there. But every episode always comes down to politics at some point. We brought policy people on because energy it's not technology, it is policy. I mean, you can't avoid the political aspect of it. I mean, I think that's fundamental to any energy conversation you have.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Well, what do you think about you talk a lot, you've had a lot of guests on in the energy transition side. What do you feel like is working well, and what do you feel like is maybe overhyped and is not really getting to where it needs to go? I mean, because I see some things in that space I think are really interesting, that are probably making a difference, that are driving innovation, that probably have a pretty decent runway. And then I see other stuff where I'm like, this is kind of just hype. The numbers really don't seem to work. I mean, just what do you, if you had to, and this is sort of putting you on the spot, but if you had to point to some things that you say, hey, look, this is like really looks like it's working. I'm seeing this trend, and maybe here's some things that are overhyped. I mean, maybe that'll turn off some future guests if you say that
No,
technology is overhyped. But what would your thoughts be?
no, I don't know. I mean, I think, the challenge that I see is it's still the Wild West, right? And so, there's so many. I mean, I could put up 50 different solar projects tomorrow, and people that are going to save you energy and get you behind the meter and do all that. I've done a few episodes like that. Some are credible, some aren't. Some of it's just shaving, and getting a little cheaper rate and things like that. But I think that it's a little bit of a distraction. So, like I said, I'm a big proponent of fusion. I like it, but there's a pretty logical argument saying, look, if we go invest in all these crazy ideas, and it's not really a crazy idea, but things that are futuristic today, you're taking money out of putting into electrification or into carbon capture or some other technology that can help solve the problem of reducing carbon today. And so I see that. I think there's been some storage ideas that I've had. I had an episode with one storage company on, and I got more. I mean, I get a lot of mail already. Usually it's positive. Very seldom do I get negative mails, but I got a earful of mail about this, one storage technology I brought up, and they like, these guys are crooks. They don't understand energy, blah blah blah, and they went on this whole thing. And I think it's distractions is what the problem is for most people. The one area that I wish people were more open to is small modular reactors. I
Mm.
think there's a future in that. I also hate to see that there's a bunch of base load. Yes, it's expensive to build the way it was built in the past, but if you're going to electrify everything, I think you're going to need base load somewhere and get that. So I'm a believer that that should be there, but politically, it's a very unpopular thing. So that would be one that I would like to see more. And I know that a lot of folks don't see that as an option. I get feedback on that that's not the right way to go. Um,
Well, I mean, there's a lot of pathways to achieving a different energy future than we are today. And I think there's a lot of good arguments beyond climate that for advocating for new technology, right? I mean, oil and gas is a finite resource. If you believe the human race is going to be around for thousands of years or more, then we should look to find things that are less finite, right? I mean, that's not a hey, the world's going to end thing. That's just a hey, this is a good business practice
but
thing.
I
Like
think
we,
your business
you know,
question you asked, like the IRA did quite a bit. So as an American living in Europe, Europe has always had a bit of pride that they're ahead of the U.S. in renewables. And frankly, I'd come back home. I'm in and out of the U.S. all the time, and at surface it seemed that way. The IRA, I think, is a real changing point. I think, whether your politics are for big government or not, that's a different situation. But what it is doing is it probably will drive things like hydrogen down to put US in the lead there, and ammonia and other technologies that we could bring out and other molecule type solutions that in scale could work, right? So right now, I mean, I don't think unless certain use cases, green hydrogen's good, but it may not be ideal in the future. So I think when you have the economies, you're going to start seeing technologies come down. I talked about solar from space. The technology's been around a long time to do that. It's just not cost effective. It would be ridiculously expensive to do unless there's some advances, right? And so what I think we'll see is I think we'll see economies of scale. But right now, what we need is just grid scale storage in a way that's workable. And then, how is the electrification? Is the electrification of all EVs and automobiles, is that a foregone conclusion, or is that an incremental step to some other transportation in the future?
yeah, for sure. Well, it seems like the problem that I run into is that everybody, including the oil and gas industry, seems to be talking their book, right? And it's like, yes, and I've been pleasantly surprised with some of the support that I've seen for nuclear. Like you mentioned, it can be politically unpopular, but I actually had a guy reach out recently who's doing a oil and gas advocacy group for nuclear energy, which I thought was really refreshing. I'm like, that's interesting. And they're trying to get executives to sign on in the oil and gas industry to say that we support nuclear. And I'm like, that's cool that they're doing that. But most people, it seems like, are talking their book. And so if you point out like a solution that says, hey, if we switched everything from coal to natural gas, we could, save the emissions of electrifying the entire U.S. car fleet or adding this many wind turbines or solar panels. And then you get a lot of pushback from people saying that, oh, yeah, that would reduce a lot of emissions, but we can't do that because it's a fossil fuel. And you see the same pushback from both sides. It just seems like that's an issue, is that everybody's kind of got an incentive to push a sweeping change in one direction,
Well,
whichever side you're on.
if you look at some of the things, right, if we didn't have the oil industry do all the marine technology they had, where would our floating wind and offshore be? Look where it's all fundamentally come from. Like, look at the labs that were in place and where the technology came from. So I'm not saying go drill more new wells or whatever. Maybe you need to, right, depending on what demand is. But at the same time, there is a lot of share, and I do see these big oil companies putting a lot of resource into renewables just to protect their business, right? So as a free market kind of guy, is very American. I think ultimately when the economics drive it, things happen. Early on my show, I had someone that ran like Total's solar project for Asia, and he was talking about it, and he said, "Look, solar didn't really take off in commercial until it was economically viable, right? People wanted to do the right thing. They could have whatever corporate policy they want, but the shareholders wanted to see value. And so as these technologies get more mature and the cost comes down, there's going to be a shift. And the legacy oil and gas companies and stuff aren't going to want to be out of the game. They're going to shift with time, and you can see that based on the investments. Whether they're buying charging station networks around and the companies to provide that, whether they realize they're an electrical company, they need software components to have a distributed grid. All that transition is taking place around us every day. The question just is it going to happen fast enough for someone that's looking at climate change and says, "Hey, the emissions are the problem." And you and I live in North America, where yes, climate change, hurricanes, tornadoes, and all that are getting worse, and there's things that you could argue about. But if you're middle class and better, you can probably afford to deal with these things. The thing at the COP conferences and things that people are worried about is the folks that can't afford to deal with it. Island nations close to the equator, or someone that's poor, or something like that. And so, the arguments and, what's the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and some other stuff that you could go say, will tell you, say, hey, look, people are better with higher incomes and things like that. I don't know that I totally buy into that argument. It seemed a little bit forced at times. But I think, from first world problems, they're going to get through climate change because you'll build, your codes will change, you'll move away. It's the poorer people that are going to have the bigger problems if you're believing all the data points and the data is accurate, right?
Yeah. Do you think do you focus at all? And one thing that being like a free markets kind of capitalist driven ideology person, I've always been very focused on the consumer and kind of bottom up trends. And I think that a lot of the energy transition is very top down focused. It's like, we got to mandate this. We got to get, tax credits for this. We've got to push these things on people. Everybody's going to switch to an electric car. Everybody's going to want renewable energy, all these things. And it's like, where it breaks down for me is like, that sounds great, but it has to be a demand pull, not, a supply push. You can't push it onto people, because ultimately the consumer is going to make choices around their life. And I think sometimes that gets lost a little bit in the energy transition discussion. It's kind of like, we're going to change the world and we're going to force it. And it's like, well, you can force people to do things, but the better way to get people to do things would be to have them want it, and to have them say, this is a better product. It's a better service. It's a more reliable source of energy. It makes my life better. Do you see that at all, where like, seems like it's kind of top down
So,
on the
so
energy
I, I
transition
think
side?
I think we're getting to the point where there is demand, and if people don't want it, like, there's folks that will say, I much prefer my gas car than an electric car or whatever, and they're going to vote with their checkbook, right? And I think
Sure.
that will take place. I think where government's role is when there's an impact, right? I mean, if I look at climate change, that is, what are insurance rates going to be in Florida? What are they going to be in Tornado Alley and things like that, right? What was the impact of 100-year events every 3 or 4 years? And those are going to be a climate decision, not because someone may not care about the planet. They care about what they can do with their spending power and things like that, or they won't be able to get insurance or build where they want to build. So where the government can come in is help incentivize. That's why I said the IRA, whether you like it or hate it politically, it's creating jobs, right? If I look at the economy and the hangover from COVID and things like that, if I were 20 something, I'd be going into energy somewhere. It doesn't matter what skills. If I'm on the sales side, I'm on the marketing side, I'm on the engineering side, there's going to be energy jobs into the future because of this transition taking place. And when you get the economies of scale, the prices will come down. But I think the products need to be good. The electricity needs to be easy. It needs to work, right? You can't be like a 1960s off the grid hippie, trying to build like this kind of I want to have my experience. One of the complaints I had when I moved to Europe is it's hotter than hell. It's getting hotter and hotter there in the summers, and they don't really have regulation that allows air conditioning. So I live in Switzerland, and in your house, you can only have portable air conditioning, which is really inefficient. It's like rather than setting a standard like a cafe standard of a car saying mileage should be this or that, and then letting the industry figure out how to do it, they basically said, no, you just have to go, you have to have one a portable unit. And to me, that's counterintuitive to the energy because I don't want to sit in a 90-degree apartment. I want my apartment to be comfortable, right? I just want to make sure I do it efficiently and I can afford to do it.
Yeah, and I think like the distinction you made with incentives, I've been a big fan of like the carrot versus the stick, and you'll see problems like methane leaks, and it's like, look, this is a solvable problem relatively. I mean, there are some issues with older, for example, LDC gathering systems that may be really old in the Northeast. It'd be very hard to plug all those leaks, but a lot of the methane leaks and the emissions come from wellhead facilities, and you can put incentive plans in place, and you're seeing a little bit of that. Like I had a guest on that runs a large E&P operation and has a bunch of wells, and they got some debt, and the debt had a covenant basically that said if you can reduce your emissions from these methane leaks by 50%, you get a lower interest rate on the debt. And so guess what? And they had 2 years to do it, and they did it in like 6 months, right? Because they were incentivized to go out and do it. And it really wasn't that complicated of a technology. But I think that where a lot of people get caught up is like, we need to punish people. We need to punish people for having emission leaks. We need to, we need to make these oil and gas companies' lives miserable. And it's like, well, that's going to raise the cost of energy because you're adding expenses to them. It's like, and it's even like with my kids, like if I try to punish them and put them in timeout, like sure, that can work a little bit. But if I give them incentives, it's like, hey, you do these chores, you're going to get an allowance, or you're going to get this toy that you want, or whatever it is. Feels like that works better. What are your views on like the carrot versus the stick in terms of trying to force these energy behaviors?
So I think it's a little bit of both, right? I'm not a big incentive guy for like rebates and plans like that because when they end, the program goes away and the program should stand for itself. To jumpstart or start an industry, it's good. The upside is if it creates jobs and it does, I mean, the greater impact the economy. If people want to use less oil, they should vote with their checkbook, right? I mean, if you think the world's going to a bad spot, don't go buy oil and don't put oil and don't buy power from someone that's not generating green. But it's a little bit hard, and there's a number of efforts in place that try to show people, but you really don't know, right? If you look at what certificates, what Rex were doing early on, and how easy it was to buy green energy somewhere else where you're producing it somewhere else, and it was a bit of a game, right? Or carbon taxes, where you want to pay for carbon and carbon market. I mean, I think a lot of that's just really hard for the average consumer unless you want to spend a lot of time focused on energy, worrying about it. All you really want is your electrons to create your lifestyle in a way that you feel good about it. But I don't think you want to go listen to my podcast for 8 episodes to figure out, oh, shoot, I need to go do something or read a book about it every time you want to have, turn on the power or open the refrigerator.
Yeah.
And so I think it's hard. I mean, I think the oil companies are in business. They have shareholders and they have people to keep, people were upset with these windfall taxes and they were making a lot of money with what was going on. And then, people were upset that, there was the shortage of supply. And what I think people don't understand in the hydrocarbon space is it takes a long time to go research and get new resource going. It's not like we can go, oh, prices are higher this month. Next month I'm going to have a lot more oil available. I mean, the lead time of those projects is long. And with assets becoming stranded and things like that, I think it's going to be hard. Now, granted, they've had record profits, so I'm not crazy. It just is what it is. But I mean, as you go through the transition, the bigger challenge is what assets are going to be stranded, or your car. If you go buy a gas car today, or you got a new truck or whatever, and we mandate in 2035, all you can do is have an electric vehicle. What happens to the value, the residual of that going down, and how do we have that economic transition so that people that want to go that way can?
Yeah, for sure. What do you think about being in Europe right now and just the perspective on energy? I know things were really bad last year. There's been some relief, but has it changed people's views at all? I've had a couple other guests on from Europe and different countries, and they have said that the regular average person is still kind of just not that in tune with it. Do you feel like people's are paying more attention to it because of the cost of energy going up, or because of what the war in Ukraine has done to the supply and just the energy security aspect? Is it more on people's minds, or are people just still trying to live their life and not really paying much attention to it?
So I think that the energy problem in Europe isn't over yet, right? So we got very fortunate having a mild winter. Folks still get gas from wherever they get gas, whatever brand it's being under, and there's mechanisms to get gas. I think energy independence and national security became important at the country level, and the bet is going to be renewables. That's what they're going to do, right? I mean, you definitely saw coal plants fire up, but Germany shut down its last nuclear plants, I don't know, a few weeks ago or whatever that was, just recently. And you had a base load that wasn't putting CO2 out, and they chose to shut that down. So there's a lot of pressure on electrification and making that work. I don't think in the day to day it makes a lot of difference, but it shut businesses down. Bakeries couldn't afford to run. There's businesses that went out in the early parts of it. I think there was a gas problem before the war. So if you go back, I'm in the trading space and look at the market. It wasn't just the Ukraine that sent that over the top. There was problems there, but I think it's still on people's radar, and it's the problem is longer now. Fortunately, LNG terminals were finished up, so that we can get North American LNG there. So it's good for the U.S. because we have a fairly good supply of LNG. So if you look at it economically, it's an opportunity for countries like the U.S. to offer some relief to Europe, but it doesn't help the green initiatives in Europe that they're mandated across the EU. And I don't think people changed their lifestyle. People that couldn't afford it were cold this winter. They just didn't have the heat. But we were really lucky. It didn't go to where it could have been. And when we had the price spikes, it was artificially incented because people were trying to build reserves up at the beginning. So if you looked at the gas market, we had this unnatural spike in gas prices. And then after the reserves were there and it wasn't used up, the prices came back down to something more reasonable. So it was a temporary state of being for the market. It wasn't as predicted. The world didn't really catastrophically end yet.
Yeah. Well, it's just interesting because I've talked to a lot of smart people around electrification and the grid. And I think that the consensus that I've heard from people that really know their stuff is that renewables are easy to a point, right? You can get a penetration of 30, 40%, 50%. You start to get above a certain level and it becomes a real challenge. And I think there's a lot of people that don't agree with that. They think it could be 100% renewables. I just wonder if
Well,
we're
the
going to
question
hit
is
up against
when.
some.
The question isn't if, right? So I think it can be. The question is, is demand response. I was speaking to someone the other day, and they made the point and said, look, there's enough energy to go around because I'm not a big believer that if everything was electrified, that we have enough infrastructure in place that there wouldn't be pain along the way. But there's some, from large grid operators in Europe that think there is, and they said it's really the same as your highway. I'm here in Houston, and if I want to go home at 5 o'clock, I'm going to be sitting in traffic, right? So if I want to go home quickly, I go home at shift my work hours a little bit, like they do in California and Silicon Valley or whatever. And I think to a degree that works. That the thing that makes me nervous is the total belief in demand response. Because I just remember the early programs where you'd get some credit, and the power company would put something on your air conditioning unit, and they could at a heat when there's a heat going around, they could cut it down a little bit, and I don't know that the world's ready for that, and that most American lifestyle that we want to have our power down. You wouldn't feel it, right? Because your house stays cool, and they're taking it across a million homes or whatever, and they can do it in scale, but I just wonder if everybody's electrified, if we're quite ready there, or if there's enough infrastructure there. And I think storage at utility scale is still going to be is still a challenge that isn't totally met yet. It's coming out all the time. There's always I'm doing stories and talking to people that are doing amazing things. So we can generate wind, we can generate solar, but what's the choice of grid stick storage that you want, and can you do it in large enough scale to make a difference? And there's plenty of experts that will argue to me absolutely, and there's plenty that would say, yeah, we're not quite ready for prime time.
Yeah. Well, my thing with demand response is it's always been if the answer is that we have to use less energy or they have to control the amount of energy or tell you when you can and can't use it, feels a little backwards, like it's going kind of in reverse. Like you should just have an abundance and it should be cheap. But I think that is a challenge when you add in intermittency and all these problems.
Yeah.
I'm not one of these people that says renewables have no place. I mean, I live in Oklahoma. There's 40% wind here. I mean, but the
But the
reason
U.S.
why I
had
think
an advantage, right? So we went through. I remember when LEDs were being mandated on us, right? I kind of missed my old light bulbs, right? And but if you look across where we had huge savings as a country across nationally, is we got savings because of LEDs, right? That was a huge savings across the country. I mean, the biggest things. I mean, I was talking to national labs and their projects they were doing in NREL was about construction and things. They're looking where the biggest return investment. So if you look at this kind of a pragmatic approach, you asked me, my approach is pragmatic. It's like heat pumps. It's insulation. If you were an average homeowner, where could you put your dollars the most today? It's probably putting a layer of insulation in your roof and making sure your windows are good. Before you start doing a lot of this other stuff and just using less energy that way, where you still live your lifestyle, you haven't changed your thermostat up to 90 degrees, you haven't done the things differently, but you would still use less energy and demand would go down. Those are probably incremental steps. But the problem is, like you said, how do I alienate my listeners? As I say something like that, and if you really believe, which most people do, a lot of the urgency there, that's probably not going to be fast enough for a lot of people would tell me, and I'm sure I'll get comments in your chat.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Chris, it's been great. Thank you for coming on. We should have done this sooner, and I feel like we could talk for another hour pretty easily. But what's the best place for people to find you at?
Best place is to go to Insider's Guide to Energy, insidersguide-to-energy.com. Find us on YouTube, find us on Facebook, wherever you want. And we've got content coming out once or twice a week, every week.
All right, Chris, thanks a lot. Thanks, guys.